11th day of the war, the USS Abraham Lincoln takes a hit that Iran has been trying to land since February 28th. And the explosion that tears through her bow section is visible from every ship in the strike group. A white flash followed by a column of black smoke, climbing 200 feet above the flight deck before the wind breaks it apart. The damage control teams are moving before the smoke clears. The flooding alarm sounds throughout the forward compartments at 14:31 and 44 seconds. And on the flight deck directly above the impact point, an A-18F Super Hornet sits on the catapult, engines running. Pilot in the cockpit waiting for the launch signal that the flight deck officer gives at 14:32 and 11 seconds, 40 seconds after the missile hit. Because the Abraham Lincoln's flight deck never stops, and the captain never gave the order to pause operations, and the Super Hornet launches into the afternoon sky over the Arabian Sea as if nothing happened at all. That image, a carrier launching aircraft 40 seconds after taking a missile hit, is the one Iran's planners never modeled in the 2 years they spent designing the weapon that just hit her. Iran announced 3 days ago that its remaining missile forces would fire only weapons carrying warheads weighing more than 1 ton. The announcement was a signal of desperation dressed as escalation. An admission that everything lighter had failed, that the new missiles and the Shahids and the Fates had been intercepted or jammed or turned around. That the only path left was the heaviest weapon in the remaining inventory. The Sejjil 3 is Iran's answer to that problem. A 2-stage solid-fuel ballistic missile carrying a unitary warhead weighing 1,100 kilograms, more than a ton of high explosive in a single penetrating warhead designed specifically to defeat the layered armor off large warships. It is not a precision weapon in the conventional sense. It does not need to be. A warhead this size detonating against a carrier's hull does not need to be precise. It needs torque. The Abraham Lincoln's Spy-1 radar detected the Sejjil-3 launch at 14:22, 9 minutes and 31 seconds before impact. The missile rose from a mobile launcher positioned on a coastal ridge overlooking the Gulf of Oman, climbing steeply through 80,000 feet before beginning its terminal descent toward the carrier operating 340 kilometers to the south. 9 minutes and 31 seconds ice enough time to engage a standard ballistic missile threat multiple times over against the Sejjil 3. Those 9 minutes revealed something the strike group had not fully appreciated until the engagement was already running. The first SM-6 interceptor launched at 14:24 from USS Delbert D. Black, 30 nautical miles north of the Abraham Lincoln on the formation's threat axis. The SM-6 is the most capable ballistic missile interceptor in the U.S. Navy's surface fleet inventory, and it has defeated every ballistic missile threat it has engaged in this conflict. The fire control solution was clean. The intercept geometry favorable, and the SM-6 reached its calculated intercept point at 14:25 and 33 seconds. The SIL-3 was not there. The missile had executed a terminal maneuver, a course correction in its final descent phase that shifted its trajectory by 4.2 degrees enough to invalidate the intercept solution in the 3 seconds between the fire control calculation and the SM-6 foot's arrival at the intercept point. The SM-6 detonated in empty air. The Sejjil 3 continued descending. The second SM-6 launched 11 seconds later on an updated solution. The same thing happened. The Sejjil 3 corrected again 2.8 degrees this time, and the second interceptor found nothing. The third SM-6 fired from USS Michael Murphy on the formation's eastern flank was assigned the most aggressive intercept geometry available, but a nearly head-on approach that gave the Sejjil 3 the minimum possible time to execute a correction maneuver. It came the closest of the 3 attempts. The interceptor detonated 23 meters from the Sejjil 3's airframe at 14:27, and the fragmentation pattern from the SM-6 foot's warhead struck the missile's guidance section, damaging 2 of its 4 control fins and degrading its terminal maneuvering capability by approximately 60%. The Sejjil 3 was hurt. It was not stopped. Its trajectory became partially unpredictable. A wounded missile falling at 3,200 meters per second toward a carrier it could no longer steer with precision, but could no longer avoid hitting entirely either. At 14:28, the Phelan CIWS on the Abraham Lincoln's bow activated and began tracking the incoming contact. Against a ballistic missile in terminal phase, the Phelan's faces the same mathematical problem it faces against every hypersonic threat. The engagement window is measured in fractions of a second, and the probability of the 20 rounds intercepting a target moving at this speed is calculated by the system's own fire control computer at 6.1%. The phalanx fired anyway. The rounds found nothing. The Abraham Lincoln's captain, Rear Admiral Christine Hayes, had been watching the engagement from the Combat Information Center since the launch was detected at 14:22. She had watched 3 SM-6 fail to stop the missile and 1 partially damage it. And she had watched the phalanx fire its burst into empty air. And she understood with the particular clarity of someone who has run this scenario in simulations for 11 years that the Sejjil 3 was going to hit her ship. The question was not whether, the question was where a ballistic missile in terminal phase descends at a steep angle, typically between 60 and 80 degrees from horizontal. The Sejjil 3 with its guidance fins damaged was descending at 71 degrees on a trajectory that if uncorrected would impact the Abraham Lincoln's flight deck. The worst possible outcome, a 1,100 kilograms warhead detonating among parked aircraft and fuel lines, and the crew working the deck. Hayes had one option, and she had approximately 90 seconds to execute it. She ordered all ahead flank and hard left rudder. The Abraham Lincoln 100,000 tons of nuclear-powered aircraft carrier began her turn. The physics of what Hayes was attempting had never been tested operationally. A ballistic missile descending at 71 degrees on a damaged trajectory cannot correct quickly and auto-track a target that changes its aspect angle in the final 60 seconds off flight. By turning the ship hard topward, Hayes was changing the Abraham Lincoln's presentation to the incoming missile, rotating the carrier so that her narrow bow rather than her wide flight deck was facing the Sejjil 3's projected impact point. A carrier's bow is not armored against ballistic missile impacts. Nothing is. But the bow section houses anchor chains, void spaces, and damage-controlled compartments specifically designed to absorb flooding. The flight deck houses aircraft, fuel, weapons, and 5,000 people working in the open air. The choice between them was not a difficult one. The Sejjil 3 impacted the Abraham Lincoln starboard bow at 14:31 and 22 seconds. 14 m above the waterline, 31 maft of the anchor hawse. The 1,100 warhead detonated on contact. The explosion tore a 22 m hole in the bow plating, collapsed 3 forward void compartments, ruptured the anchor chain locker, and sent a pressure wave through the forward section that buckled 2 interior bulkheads and started flooding in 4 compartments simultaneously. The blast column rose 200 feet above the flight deck. The ship shuddered from bow to stern hard enough to throw crew members off their feet in compartments 400 meters from the impact point. 2 sailors working on the bow anchor detail were killed instantly. 7 more were injured in the forward compartments by the pressure wave and collapsing bulkheads. The flooding began at 14:31 and 44 seconds. For forward compartments taking water simultaneously, the damage control system registering the breaches and activating counter-flooding automatically to prevent the bow from going down. The damage control teams, 340 sailors trained specifically for this, were moving through the forward section within 90 seconds of impact, shoring bulkheads, closing watertight doors, fighting to contain the flooding to the forward compartments and keep it from spreading. Aft, the Abraham Lincoln was listing 2.3 degrees to starboard from the asymmetric flooding. Her speed had dropped from 30 knots to 22 knots as the flooding increased drag on the bow. Her flight deck was intact. Her propulsion was intact. Her weapons systems were intact. Her Aegis combat suite was intact. At 14:32 and 11 seconds, the flight deck officer gave the launch signal to the A-18F sitting on the bow catapult. The pilot felt the carrier shudder beneath him as the catapult fired, and the Super Hornet accelerated from 0 to 165 knots in 2.2 seconds and climbed away from the flight deck into the afternoon sky. 40 seconds after a 1,100 kilograms warhead had detonated 14 m above the water line on the ship's bow, the Abraham Lincoln was still launching aircraft. But the engagement was not finished, because the moment the Sejjil 3 launched from its mobile launcher on the coastal ridge at 14:22, it did something that every large solid-fuel ballistic missile does at ignition. It burned. The 2-stage solid-fuel motor of a Sejjil 3 produces an exhaust plume at ignition that reaches temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Celsius and is visible to infrared sensors from distances exceeding 800 kilometers. The Abraham Lincoln's own passive infrared tracking system had captured the launch signature at 14:22 and 0.4 seconds. The precise jet coordinates of the launcher, the azimuth off the launch, and the exhaust trail of the first stage motor as it burned out and separated at 14:22 and 31 seconds. That data had been recorded continuously and automatically from the moment off launch. The mobile launcher had begun relocating the moment the missile cleared the rail. Iranian doctrine for mobile ballistic missile launchers is precise. Launch and move immediately. Reach the secondary position within 8 minutes. Never stay at the firing point longer than necessary. The launcher's crew had trained this sequence hundreds of times. They knew that American systems could backtrack a launch to its origin point. What they did not account for was what happens to the thermal signature of a solid-fuel rocket motor after burnout. The exhaust gases cool slowly, leaving a thermal trail in the atmosphere above the launch point that dissipates over approximately 4 minutes and 40 seconds at the altitude and temperature conditions present over the Gulf of Oman on this afternoon. Not a trail of smoke visible to the naked eye. A trail of cooling exhaust gases visible to the passive infrared sensors on an aircraft flying at altitude with the right equipment. The 2F/A-18F Super Hornets flying combat air patrol at 28,000 feet northeast of the formation had been tracking the Sejjil 3's launch signature since 14:22. Their 8R targeting pods had locked onto the thermal trail the moment the missile cleared the coastal ridge, and they had been following it continuously through the entire 9 minutes and 31 seconds of the engagement, watching the launcher relocate in real time, tracking its movement along the coastal road toward its secondary position 6 kilometers from the firing point, building a targeting solution that updated automatically as the vehicle moved. By the time the Sejjil 3 impacted the Abraham Lincoln's bow at 14:31, the two Super Hornets had a targeting solution accurate to within 4 m on a vehicle that was 4.7 kilometers from its original firing position and moving at 35 km per hour toward a secondary position it was never going to reach. At 14:33, 2 minutes and 11 seconds after the missile hit, the lead Super Hornet released 2 GBU-31 JDAM guided bombs from 28,000 feet. The GBU-31 is a 2,000 lbps guided weapon with a circular error probable of less than 5 m. The targeting coordinates were updated continuously until the moment of release using the thermal trail data that had been building for 11 minutes. The first bomb impacted the launcher vehicle at 14:34 and 22 seconds, 1 minute and 22 seconds before the vehicle would have reached its secondary position. The second bomb impacted 3 seconds later. The launcher, the crew, and Iran's ability to fire another Sejjil 3 from that position ceased to exist at 14:34 and 22 seconds. In the Abraham Lincoln's Combat Information Center, Rear Admiral Hayes received the bomb damage assessment at 14:36. Launcher destroyed. No secondary position reached. She looked at the damage control status board. Flooding contained to 4 forward compartments. List stabilized at 2.3 degree. Speed 22 knots. Flight deck fully operational. All weapons systems nominal. 9 aircraft had launched from the flight deck since the missile hit point. 3 more were on approach for recovery. She picked up the circuit to 5th Fleet and made her report in 2 sentences. Abraham Lincoln has taken a hit forward. She is operational and continuing the mission. Iran fired its most powerful remaining weapon at the most powerful carrier in the world, a 100 kg warhead that tore a 22 mi hole in her bow and killed 2 sailors and flooded 4 compartments and lifted the ship 2.3 degree to starboard. And 40 seconds after it hit, the flight deck launched another aircraft. And 2 minutes and 11 seconds after it hit, the Super Hornets found the launcher that fired it. And 1 minute and 22 seconds after that, the launcher was gone. The Abraham Lincoln never stopped flying. She never slowed below 22 knots. She never paused flight operations. She turned back toward the mission with a hole in her bow and kept going, because that is what the most powerful carrier in the world does when you hit her with everything you have left. And it still is not.